Welcome to Whispers of Asia, where ancient beliefs aren't just remembered, they return. In forgotten corners of the East, there are stories that were never meant to be told. Tales passed down in hushed voices, scribbled in temple shadows, or buried in unmarked soil. Here, we breathe life into those cursed truths, and tonight, we speak of a name that should never be spoken. This is the story of a mother's love that defied death, a ritual forbidden for generations, a child who never decayed, and a village that learned too late. When you bind a soul to the living world, something else binds back. Some names bring life, others erase it. You're listening to The Nameless Name.
The rains arrived early that year, long before the cicadas could sing, before the rice fields turned gold. The clouds hung low over the village like a soaked burial shroud. Thunder rolled across the jungle hills in heavy, unhurried groans, as if the sky itself were grieving something it couldn't name. And in the last house before the forest, where the stone steps cracked from the weight of time and banyan roots wrapped tightly around wooden beams, a woman gave birth in silence. Her name was Me, and her daughter never cried. Not once. There was no scream, no breath, no flutter of fingers, only stillness, and a tiny body wrapped in cotton and rainwater, cradled in arms that refused to let go. The midwife, her eyes heavy with knowing, whispered, "She's already gone." But Me didn't answer. She sat there on the wooden floor, cradling the lifeless form to her chest, rocking gently, humming a lullaby only she seemed to remember. Outside, the wind stirred the bamboo chimes like restless fingers tapping on glass. And that was the first night someone heard the whisper. In the old ways, babies in the village were never named at birth, not truly. Instead, they were given temporary names, ugly names, confusing names, names like frog or trash or nothing, meant to trick the wandering spirits that searched for newborn souls to steal. The real name, the sacred name, would come later, after the child had survived a year. Only then would the family gather by firelight, consult the ancestors, and speak aloud the name that would anchor the soul into the living world. It was protection, a pact with the unseen. But grief makes desperate promises. And on the seventh night, Me broke the old pact. She waited until the house was empty, until her mother-in-law fell asleep mumbling prayers, and the oil lamp flickered into blue shadow. She carried the bundle wrapped in black silk up to the altar room, the one that hadn't been used since her grandfather's funeral, and placed the child gently on the cold stone floor. No candle, no chanting, just the sound of water dripping from the rafters and the breath of a mother who had read too many forbidden things. From under her shirt, she took out a small bone shard, yellowed and brittle, wrapped in red thread soaked in grave lotus water. She had cut it from the urn of her own grandmother, a woman who had once been a priestess of naming before the practice was banned. With trembling fingers, she dipped the thread into a bowl of night water, collected at the exact moment the rain had stopped 3 nights ago, and whispered something into her child's ear. A name that had never been spoken aloud before. A name meant only for the dead. The wind outside stopped. Utter stillness. Then a breath. The child's chest rose, not fully, not with the life of lungs or blood, but enough to make Me gasp and clutch her own arms, falling backward into the shadows. The baby's eyes opened, not wide, not screaming, just enough to reflect the dim light of the ancestral altar, just enough to look back. No cry, no sound, but somewhere beneath the floorboards, something knocked once, sharp, hollow, like the echo of a name too old to be remembered. The next morning, the child was still cold, still unmoving, but her eyes never closed again. They buried no one. The husband, distant, still posted at a southern border, never received word. Me's mother-in-law asked questions, but Me claimed the body had already been taken by the temple. No funeral, no offerings, just an empty cradle and a home that smelled of old incense and wet silk. In secret, Me kept the child in the altar room. Every day she cleaned her, sang to her, brushed the strands of hair that had somehow grown longer by the week. And every night, the girl blinked. Once. Only once. Always when Me whispered the name again, that cursed, sacred name that no one else could know. Weeks passed, then months. The neighbors said little. They had seen grief before, stillbirths, lost children, wives left hollow by fate. But something about Me's house began to change. The air inside felt heavier. Mirrors would fog from the inside. Pets refused to cross the threshold. A visiting cousin swore she saw a little girl's face reflected in the surface of the water pot, even though no child was there. They said nothing, but they began to look away when passing the home. The first death came quietly. A village boy, curious, playful, had climbed the back wall of Me's home and peeked into the second-floor window. He saw the girl sitting upright beside the family altar, her eyes open, her mouth unmoving. Later that night, he asked his sister, "Who is that girl? What's her name?" The next morning, he could no longer speak. By sunset, he had forgotten how to write. By the third day, he had no memory of his own name or anyone else's. He wandered to the rice paddies, mumbling, eyes empty. When they found his body, it had already begun to crumble, not rot, but fall apart like ash pressed into skin. On his arm, scratched faintly in dirt, were 3 words: "Don't say name." After that, the elders gathered. They lit black incense, consulted the scrolls, whispered things in dialects no longer taught. And by the end of the meeting, they declared something that had not been spoken in over 70 years. The word name is forbidden. No one shall speak it. No one shall ask it. No one shall write it. From that night on, the village began to speak only in titles: mother, brother, fisherman, teacher, words that described, not defined. They buried the boy in silence. No plaque, no flowers, just rocks over red soil. And Me stood at the edge of the forest, watching the funeral from a distance, holding a black silk bundle against her chest. The chimes never rang again in her house. Windows stayed shut. Mirrors were removed. And still, every night, the child blinked. Sometimes twice. Sometimes she smiled. And on a cold morning, just before the monsoon returned, an old woman swore she heard something behind her as she brushed her hair before a mirror. A voice, gentle, small, whispering her name. She died before sunset, and her mirror cracked from the inside.
The rain didn't stop for 6 weeks. It poured in thick sheets, pounding the thatched roofs and turning the village paths into rivulets of brown water. Fields flooded, graves softened,
and in the silence between thunder, you could hear things, scratching inside walls that had no mice. But in the upper room of Mi's home, the air remained dry. No rot, no mold, and no smell of death. That was the first thing the midwife noticed, not the child's stillness, not her open eyes, but the absence of what should have come. There was no sour tang of decay, no flies, no discoloration, just a child, perfectly preserved. Too perfect. 3 months after the ritual, the child's skin had turned pale, not with death, but with something colder, something untouched by the natural world. Her lips were soft pink, her lashes had grown longer, and when Mi trimmed the child's fingernails with silver scissors, they grew back overnight. The body had not decayed. It had changed, subtly, slowly, but undeniably. One night, Mi swore the girl's chest moved. Not a breath, not life, but a twitch, like a reaction, like something watching her behind the stillness of that gaze. And that was when Mi began locking the altar room, not to protect the child, to protect herself. Rumors spread again. A farmer's daughter claimed to see the dead child's face in the reflection of her lantern glass. A monk passing through the village refused to sleep inside the home and muttered prayers under his breath. Mi's mother-in-law, once dismissive, now burned incense day and night and refused to say the word 10. She had seen the child too. In the mirror above the water basin, only for a moment, the reflection moved while the real world stood still. The old woman collapsed that evening. Her mouth foamed, her hands shook, and just before she lost consciousness, she whispered, "She smiled at me." The elders called for silence again. They gathered at the base of the banyan tree and ordered every mirror in the village to be covered or shattered. Bowls were turned upside down, glass jars hidden away. Even still water was to be disturbed with herbs and ash, anything to prevent reflection. But it was too late. People had already seen her. Not her body, not the girl as she was. They had seen what remained, what lingered behind mirrors and water, in windows and lanterns, the reflection that blinked without movement, the child that whispered without breath. And now, she began to speak. Not with words, but with names. The first was heard by a fisherman while washing his nets near the river. The water shimmered oddly. He leaned in, curious, and heard a soft, wet whisper ripple from beneath the surface. Tao, his wife's name. 3 nights later, Tao drowned in her sleep, found face down in her own rain pot, her reflection still shimmering on the surface. The bowl was cracked at the rim, as though something had climbed out. The villagers whispered behind shut doors. She was naming them, and they were dying. It became a pattern. A name whispered, then death. Old men, children, pregnant women, a teacher, a rice merchant, always whispered first, always followed by some unnatural passing. Drowned, vanished, withered, burned without fire. Mi said nothing. She kept to her home, locked the altar room, and sat by the stairwell with her back to the door. Sometimes she heard the child's fingernails tapping the inside of the wooden panels. Sometimes the door moved, just slightly. She placed salt around the threshold. It didn't help. One morning she woke with red thread tied tightly around her wrists, the same red thread she had used in the ritual. It hadn't been there when she went to sleep. The girl was remembering. They tried exorcisms. A traveling monk with silver bells came from the mountains. He didn't stay long. After one night in Mi's home, he left wordless, and weeks later was found by the side of the road, eyes gouged out and smile etched unnaturally across his face. In his notebook, they found only one sentence, written over and over. "She's learning how to speak." Mi finally admitted it. Not the ritual, not the name, but that she had kept the child's body and that it had not rotted. The elders demanded she turn the body over for burning. She refused. No one dared enter the house. So the village made a decision. They would silence her. They exiled me. Not to the jungle, not to another town, but socially, ritually. No one would speak to her. No one would acknowledge her presence. She was to live as if she did not exist. She had given birth to death, and in return, she would carry silence. They even removed her name from the ancestor list. Mi became nothing. But the child remained, locked upstairs, or so they hoped. Because that spring, children began to report something strange, not just reflections anymore, but dreams. Dreams of a girl with long black hair and no eyes, whispering their nicknames, their real names. One girl woke up with her name written backward in mud on her arm. One boy was found sketching the child's face in his rice porridge. The village began losing language. First nouns, then names of animals, of seasons, of emotions. Some villagers stopped speaking altogether, afraid that any word might contain a sliver of the cursed name. The silence became infectious. Even the wind seemed quieter. And still, in that altar room, the child did not rot. She remained perfect. Hair growing, nails sharpening, eyes unblinking. She did not need to breathe, because now she was memory, and memory does not die. It only waits to be called. It started with whispers in the rice fields, wind that carried syllables too broken to be words, yet too sharp to be dismissed. Old farmers began stopping mid-step, staring into nothing, as if someone had just called them, not by title, not by role, but by something deeper, something they hadn't heard in years, their own names. They came home shaking, silent. Some wept and didn't know why. Others sat at the edge of the river, dipping their hands into the reflection and watching ripples swallow their faces. It was as if the world had reached inside them and taken something small but sacred. One boy forgot his name entirely. He was 10, a quiet child, known only as Mut, little brother. But when his mother called him that, he didn't answer. So she tried his name, once, gently. He blinked, then smiled, then walked out of the house barefoot and disappeared into the mist. They found only his shirt, folded neatly at the base of the old altar tree. On it, written in charcoal, were 3 words: "I am not me." The elders called another meeting, this one under cover of darkness. The last bell was rung, the temple doors sealed, and for the first time in 3 generations, the forbidden scrolls were unrolled. There it was again, written in faded red ink. To name the dead is to unmake the living. To bind a soul to a name not yet earned is to pull the shadow from the grave. And if the name is never released, it will grow teeth.
The village chief, once a teacher, stood in the middle of the gathering, holding an old clay tablet unearthed years ago from beneath the oldest house. His voice trembled as he spoke. There was a practice before language was clean, before naming was safe. It was called Goihon Nguk, the calling of souls in reverse. He placed the tablet on the altar. Carved into it was the silhouette of a child with no mouth. And that was when the decision was made. The word name would be erased. Not just banned, not just avoided, but removed from books, from memories, from prayer, from the very roots of speech. Every written instance was to be burned. Children were retrained to speak in symbols. If one forgot and accidentally asked, "What's your name?" they would be isolated, sometimes for days, sometimes longer, until their memory faded and their voice returned hollow. One girl never returned. She was found kneeling before a broken mirror, humming a lullaby in a voice that did not belong to her. The curse didn't just silence mouths, it broke identity. A man once known as Ba Nye, respected, kind, generous, began referring to himself only as the one who digs. He no longer responded to family, friends, or his wife. And one day, after pulling a mirror from the river, he muttered, "She gave it back to me," then vanished. In his boots, left behind on the porch, was a folded slip of paper. It said, "She remembers me better than I do." The curse began to mutate. It was no longer just spoken names. Now even thinking of your own name brought unease, like the room had grown colder, like something had turned its gaze toward you. People began dreaming in third person, writing letters without signatures, avoiding self-reflection altogether. No one painted, no one carved. To record was to risk reminding the thing what you once were. Then came the fevers. One by one, villagers fell into delirium, clutching their chests, their heads, their throats, screaming names they swore they hadn't spoken in years, their mothers' names, their childhood pets, their own. Then silence, then rot. Bodies were buried without rites, without markers, without a single word. Eventually the village began to blur. Without names, directions became stories. The house with the red door, the woman who smells of ginger, the boy who doesn't blink. Even the animals stopped responding to calls, because even the dogs had once had names. And now, even they forgot who they were. In the center of it all was the child, still in the altar room, still with eyes open, still with skin unspoiled by time. She didn't need food, or breath, or prayer. She only needed memory. And every time someone thought of her, she whispered a new name. Yours. It began as a rumor carried on the wind. A child had whispered a name, and someone died. Not from sickness, not from age, not from anything the living could explain. Just gone, breathless, empty, as though their thread had been pulled too early, leaving only skin wrapped around forgetfulness. But rumors don't stay rumors for long in places where the dead speak through mirrors. Soon, the whispers became proof. The tailor was the first to admit it aloud. His hands shook as he told the village chief, "I heard my daughter say it in her sleep, the name of the midwife, over and over." The chief's face drained of color. The midwife had died just that morning, found curled beneath her bed with a cracked mirror pressed to her chest, her mouth locked in a frozen scream, but her eyes wide open, still wet, still reflecting something that wasn't in the room. Then came the school teacher. She began keeping a journal after noticing her students doodling strange symbols during lessons. Spirals, broken letters, unfinished names with missing vowels. She showed the elders a page torn from a notebook, a stick figure of a girl with black hair covering her face and a speech bubble drawn beside her mouth. Inside the bubble, only one word, a name, not a real one, but close enough. The teacher burned the page that night, but it was too late. By dawn, her students were repeating that name like a song, quiet, eerie, without emotion. By dusk, the teacher had vanished from her home. A cracked piece of chalk lay on her desk, spelling her name in backward strokes, unfinished, as though something had taken her mid-word. Whispers no longer needed breath. They lived in puddles, in steam, in surfaces that shimmered. Villagers reported hearing their own names muttered back to them from bowls of soup, from wet leaves, from the echo of footsteps in rain. One woman dipped her hands into her washing basin and heard her deceased father whisper her childhood name. She screamed until her voice broke. The next day, her tongue turned black and fell silent forever. The child no longer stayed confined to the altar room. Not fully. She was seen, not in body, but in fragments, in the shimmer of oil on water, in the shadows between lantern flickers, in the back of someone's eye just before sleep. She never walked. She glided, a stillness with a face. Her eyes were always open, and her mouth always slightly parted, as though gently breathing names into a world not meant to hear them. Mothers began sewing red thread into their children's sleeves, not for beauty, but for protection. An old belief said that red distracted the dead, that it could keep spirits from remembering the faces of the living, but it didn't stop the whispers. Children began waking up sobbing, screaming words they couldn't explain, names no one had spoken in decades, names of people long buried, names that were no longer safe. One little boy carved a name into the wooden floorboards with his fingernail, the name of a merchant who hadn't lived in the village for years. 3 days later, the merchant arrived, unaged, unchanged, and smiling in the exact same way the child did in the mirror. He didn't speak. He only whispered his own name, backward, then dropped dead. The elders convened once more. The oldest among them, a blind woman named Kubai, finally spoke what no one dared. She is not whispering names of those who will die. A long pause. She is choosing. The room fell silent. She is giving death a name to find. Soon after, it became a warning. If you hear your name whispered, run. If someone else hears it for you, hide. If no one hears it, but you begin to forget who you are, it's already too late. They tried to contain her voice. Charms were hung, mirrors shattered. The ancestral gong was struck 108 times to sever the ties between the spirit and the spoken word, but it didn't work, because it wasn't just her voice anymore. It was memory itself that had begun to whisper. People began hearing names of things they'd forgotten. First kisses, childhood toys, the name of a dog buried 20 years ago.
The whispers weren't always deadly, but they were invasive, intimate, like something had reached inside the folds of your soul and pulled out the oldest parts of you, the ones you hadn't touched in years. For some, it was nostalgic. For others, it was unbearable. One woman tore off her own ears with a rusted sickle after hearing the name of her miscarriage daughter whispered into her dreams. Her last words were, "She remembers what I buried." Mai, now half-shadow herself, spoke to no one. She stopped eating. She wrote her prayers in ash, then burned them before the ink could settle. And yet, every night, she climbed the steps to the altar room, to sit beside her daughter, to listen. Sometimes she cried, sometimes she smiled, but mostly she sat in silence, head bowed, as her daughter whispered names into the air, names that didn't yet belong to the dead, but soon would. Then one morning, the chief's name was found scratched into a piece of glass by his doorstep, not written, etched, not with a tool, but with a fingernail. He didn't wait. He walked into the forest alone, carrying no tools, no food, no name. They never found him. But deep in the jungle there's a clearing where no birds sing, no insects buzz, and the wind there smells of salt and old paper. Locals call it the place of the whispered one. No one dares to speak near it, because even now, if you listen too closely, you might hear your name, and when you do, you'll know she's chosen you next.
Long before me broke the rules, the ritual had been broken once before. Not in her lifetime, not even in her grandmother's, but the story was there, buried in whispers and worn paper, hidden beneath floorboards and pressed between layers of family shame. A tale of a child who was never meant to live, and a name that should never have been given. Me first found it in a torn page tucked between the layers of her grandmother's funeral cloth. The paper was brown with age, brittle at the edges, and written in a slanting script, half Vietnamese, half something older, something broken. She wasn't meant to read it, but grief gives permission to things that fear would normally forbid. It told of the red thread ritual, a rite outlawed generations ago, a ritual not meant for the living, but for the stillborn, for children born without breath, without voice, without a name. The practice had once been common in mountain temples, passed down through ancestral priestesses known only by titles: she who remembers, she who threads, she who watches the moon. They believed a soul lost at birth did not travel far, that it hovered, clung, waited. And if a mother was willing to bind herself, her blood, her memory, her ancestors, to the soul, it could be pulled back, but not without a cost. Never without a cost. The steps were precise. One red thread, pulled from a ceremonial shroud and soaked in water collected at midnight from a grave lotus pond. One bone, not from the child, but from a direct maternal ancestor, unearthed and cleaned with silence. One bowl carved from ancestral stone, never used for food. And finally, a name, spoken only once, whispered into the child's left ear during the still hour between night and morning. The name would not be recorded, would not be repeated, would not be heard by anyone else. To speak it again aloud was to trap the soul inside, forever.
Me had everything. She had the bone, a sliver of her grandmother's femur hidden in her wedding dowry as a protective charm. She had the thread, from her own mother's death cloth, unraveled in secret and dyed with her own blood. And she had the bowl, a polished stone dish once used to offer salt to the spirits, hidden in the corner of the ancestral altar. What she didn't have was the blessing. That part was supposed to come from the oldest living female in the bloodline. But her mother was dead, her grandmother ashes, and so Me did something no one had done in 100 years. She blessed herself. She waited until the 7th night, when, according to tradition, the soul still lingered at the door. She dressed in mourning white. She lit no candles. She carried the stillborn child wrapped in her wedding scarf up the stairs to the altar room, and she placed the body in the center of the floor, directly over the shadow cast by the ancestral incense bowl. No music, no chanting, only the storm outside and the hollow drumbeat of her own trembling heart. She unraveled the red thread slowly, wrapping it around the tiny wrist of the child, then around her own. One loop, then another. 7 in total. Each knot a tether, each knot a door closed behind her. Then came the bone, crushed into powder and mixed into the water from the grave lotus pond. The water was black, thick, smelled of something forgotten. She poured it into the stone bowl and set it beside the child's head. And finally, she bent low, her mouth inches from the child's left ear, and whispered the name. The moment she did, the bowl cracked. Not loudly, not with a scream, just a soft tick, like glass under pressure. The thread twitched, and the child's lips parted. No breath, no cry, but a presence. The air around me changed, grew denser, colder, not with death, but with intention. She backed away slowly, but something followed. Not in sound, not in sight, but inside her skin, inside her mind. A whisper, not in Vietnamese, not in any language, just recognition. The feeling of being seen by something that was not born of the world. And in the bowl, the black water swirled. After that night, she never entered the altar room without permission. She began to ask aloud, standing outside the door, "May I come in?" Sometimes the floor creaked back once, sometimes it didn't, but she never entered without that signal. Because she now understood, the ritual had worked. And it had worked too well. The name, the one she had whispered, was never spoken again, not by her, not even in thought. Because she soon learned that to even remember it too clearly brought consequences. Once she dreamed of the moment she whispered it and woke to find her lips stitched shut with red thread. No needle, no pain, just thread. It was gone by morning, but her mouth bled for 3 days. The child remained still, but she blinked more often. And sometimes, when Me placed rice at the altar, the grains would vanish. Not all, just enough to suggest presence. The thread, once tied between their wrists, now hung on the altar wall. It grew longer with time. Not because it was being stretched, but because something unseen was adding to it, knot by knot, loop by loop. Each time a name was whispered in the village, a new knot appeared, tight, silent, binding. It was no longer a thread between mother and daughter. It had become a tether to the living world. The bowl, still cracked, began to hold things that were never placed inside. Once, Mi found a strand of hair that wasn't hers. Once, a small tooth. Once, a fragment of a torn photograph, someone else's face half peeled away. She burned each object, but they returned, always in the bowl, always with moisture clinging to them as if pulled from deep underwater. She consulted no one. Who could she trust? Who would believe her? Even she didn't know what she had awakened, only that it wasn't just her daughter anymore. Something had come back with her, something that wore the girl's face, something that whispered names into water, into mirrors, into silence itself. And each time it did, another knot appeared in the red thread, another object in the bowl, another villager unmade. And still, the child never rotted. Her body remained smooth, cold, eternal. A vessel for something ancient. A girl with no breath and no decay, because death had not taken her. It had been invited in.
He came from the east, wearing a robe the color of soot and sky. A monk, or something close. No one knew his name. No one asked. In this village, names had become dangerous, spoken only by mistake, or not at all. He simply arrived with the quiet of dusk, barefoot, staff in hand, his eyes already knowing. He stood at the edge of the rice field, watching the clouds crawl low over the hills. Then he bowed toward the banyan tree, once, slowly, as if it still held power. Then he said nothing for 3 days. They offered him shelter. He refused. They offered him rice. He declined. He asked only for space and silence. He built a circle of stones outside the village's northern edge, placed 7 sticks around it in the shape of a broken wheel, and sat cross-legged in the middle, unmoving from sunrise to moonrise. At night, villagers watched from their windows as wind spiraled strangely around his form. And when they approached, he held up a hand, not in anger, but warning. On the 4th night, he spoke. Only one sentence. "You have given the forgotten a face." No one replied, because everyone knew what he meant. They brought him stories, not questions, for they feared answers. Only stories, spoken carefully, without names, without details, like riddles passed in smoke. A child who never cried, a bowl that grew heavier with silence, a woman whose lips bled from memory, a thread that stretched through time. The monk nodded after each tale, never blinking, as if he had already heard them long before arriving. Then he said, "She has learned to whisper. Soon she will learn to call." They begged him to stop it. He did not answer. Instead, he asked for a mirror. The villagers refused. They had smashed them all but one. It belonged to the weaver, a widow who had hidden it beneath her floorboards, wrapped in 9 layers of cloth and sealed with wax. She hadn't touched it in years, not since her husband's name was whispered in the river fog. But that night she brought it to the monk, her hands trembling, her mouth sealed with a strip of white cloth. The mirror was small, round, rimmed in bronze, its surface fogged by time. The monk unwrapped it slowly. The wind stopped. Some said even the insects stilled. He sat in silence with the mirror on his lap, facing the child's house. He did not speak. He only watched. The villagers did not see what he saw, but the next morning,
His hair had turned white. He asked to enter the house. Mi opened the door without a word. She looked older, thin, a woman drained not by age, but by holding something too long, like a vessel nearing its crack. He bowed to her deeply, with respect, then climbed the stairs to the altar room, alone. He was gone for an hour. When he returned, his robes were soaked, though it hadn't rained. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands trembling, but he said only this: "She does not forget." Then he collapsed. They laid him in the guest hut, covered him in blankets. He did not sleep, but whispered to himself through the night. Names, fragments of names, words that didn't belong together. Ta, nam, sa, rui, hong. Words that made no sense, yet felt like they once did. Mi sat by the doorway, listening. She did not interrupt, because she too was forgetting. Not her name, not her past, but her shape. Who she had been before the ritual, before the altar, before the child opened her eyes. The monk rose before dawn. He requested the village bell, the one never rung except for funerals or exorcisms. He stood beneath it, hands wrapped in cloth, and struck it once. The sound was deep, hollow. It echoed longer than it should have. The air shimmered. And then he spoke. "I will take her name." They didn't understand at first. He explained, the name holds the power, not the voice, not the body. The name is the anchor, and if I carry it, she will lose her weight. The villagers begged him not to. He smiled, not kindly, but with resignation. I have no name left to lose. He returned to the altar room. This time he brought offerings, salt, ash, a strand of his own hair, and a feather from a bird that had fallen dead at his feet that morning. He placed them on the floor. He sat before the child. He closed his eyes and whispered something. Not a name, but a shape of name. A syllable with no tongue. A thought without sound. And when he opened his eyes, the child blinked. He smiled. Once. Then began to speak aloud. I am. His voice cracked. I. His mouth froze. Who. His jaw trembled. Am. And then he forgot. He forgot everything. His face, his voice, his hands. He wandered from the room, barefoot, eyes wide, staring at the world as if it had never existed. He wandered into the fields, forgetting to eat, to drink, to speak. The villagers followed him, trying to help, but he did not recognize them. He could not remember what a person was. He sat by the river for days, tracing patterns in the mud, humming a tune no one had taught him. And then, one day, he simply wasn't there. No body, no tracks, only his staff lying beside a puddle. In the puddle, his reflection remained, smiling, whispering, mouthing a name no one could hear. The villagers no longer called him the monk. They called him the one who forgot himself. And they told their children, do not follow voices in the water. Do not answer if the wind says your name. Do not look at your reflection for too long. And if you ever forget who you are, do not try to remember. Let yourself go quietly, because remembering might bring her back.
The school sat at the heart of the village, a
A single-story building with a rusted bell tower and cracked chalkboards. Once it had been filled with laughter, sandals clapping against wooden floors, the sharp scent of ink and boiled cassava. But now it felt like a place holding its breath. The windows were always open, not for air, but so the reflections wouldn't linger. Mirrors had long been banned. But sometimes the children still saw her in puddles, in glass shards, in the dark curve of an ink bottle. A little girl, hair over her eyes, hands folded in her lap, always sitting in the last row, even when no desk was there. Yuen was the teacher. She had taught 3 generations, strong, stubborn, soft-spoken. The kind of woman who corrected spelling without breaking eye contact. She didn't believe in spirits, not at first, not until she began forgetting her own students. It started with a boy named Ku, or was it T? She wasn't sure. He sat at the second desk near the window, smiled often, or didn't. One morning she looked at him and realized she didn't remember his voice, or his handwriting, or whether he was even real. She looked at the attendance book. His name wasn't there, but his shoes were under the bench, still warm. Then came the drawings. At first just doodles, spirals, black circles, a stick figure with long hair. But then they grew more detailed. A girl with no eyes, a girl with a thread around her wrist, a girl sitting beside the blackboard, watching, always watching. The students wouldn't admit who drew them, but every notebook had one, even the blank ones, even the teacher's own. Yuen brought it up with the elders. They said nothing, just glanced toward Myi's house and told her gently, "If you can still remember your own name, leave the school now, before she learns yours." She didn't. She was a teacher, and teachers stayed. Then, one day, the blackboard changed. She had written the date, but when she turned back after passing out notebooks, the chalk had shifted. Instead of the date, it was a word, a name. Not hers, but someone's. She wiped it away with shaking hands. The chalk bled. That night she dreamed of the girl, sitting in the last row, staring with eyes she didn't have, whispering something over and over. Not a name, not a word, just syllables that echoed like water dripping in a well. When Yuen woke, her pillow was damp, not from sweat, from river water. Children started disappearing, not physically, not at first. They'd be present, smiling, reading aloud, and then the next day they'd sit quietly, blank-eyed. Their writing would slant backward, their drawings more detailed. One girl wrote her name in reverse on the wall again and again until her fingertips bled. The next day, she didn't come to school. No one remembered her name, only her shoes, still lined up by the door. Yuen began forgetting words, first small ones, broom, pencil, song, then colors, then emotions. She could point at things, describe their texture, their smell, but the names? Gone. She stood in front of the class one day and said, "Open your..." But the word book would not come. She wept in the hallway, clutching her throat, as if the language itself had been taken from her. She found a drawing in her pocket that night. She didn't remember putting it there. It showed a woman with her mouth sewn shut, sitting at a teacher's desk. She began writing her own name every night, on paper, on mirrors, on her hands, anywhere. She thought it would help, until she saw it written not by her, on the classroom wall in ashes, and the letters moved. They unwrote themselves while she watched. One morning, she came to school and found every desk filled, not with students, but with reflections. The windows showed children who weren't there. The glass of the water jug shimmered with extra faces. Even the ink in the bottles rippled when she passed, as if something were breathing beneath it. The girl was in every surface, always the last row, always the same posture, as if she were studying the living. She couldn't take it anymore. She went to Myi's house, stormed in, demanded to see the child. Myi didn't speak. She only moved aside, and Yuen walked up the steps, trembling. She opened the altar room. Inside, the child sat upright, eyes open, smiling. Her mouth moved, forming the first syllables of Yuen's name. Yuen screamed, but no sound came out. She ran home. She smashed every object that could hold reflection. She tried to forget her name. She bit her tongue until it bled. She burned her photographs. She tore her school records. She whispered to herself, "No name, no name, no name." But it was too late, because the next morning she was found kneeling in her classroom, every wall covered in names, names no one remembered. Some were real, some were new. All were written in dust, and hers was missing. She didn't die, not in body, but her mind, gone. She wandered the village, teaching no one, carrying invisible books, speaking in gibberish. Children followed her, thinking she was playing, but she was only repeating shadows. And if you looked into her eyes, you saw the classroom, still full, still waiting. They say the school is closed now, but some nights, if you walk by, you hear chalk scratching. You hear children reciting names that have no mouths. You see a teacher writing on the board, but there's no chalk, no board, no teacher. Just a girl in the back row, smiling.
Silence became law, not by vote, not by order, but by survival. No one remembered exactly when the last full conversation had happened in the village. Maybe it was during the rice harvest, maybe the funeral, maybe the day the monk forgot himself. But slowly, language dissolved, not from tongues, but from fear. Because now even syllables held weight, and every word was a risk. People no longer greeted one another. They nodded, they pointed, they gestured, they hummed, tapped fingers, moved lips without sound, and it was understood, because silence had become its own language. They stopped naming the days, stopped naming the places. The school was no longer Trungku. It was simply there. The river became that way. Homes were identified by smell, by the shape of their fence, by how the wind moved through their eaves. No one used titles, not even mother, father, sister. Those were still too close to names. They were replaced by looks, long, deep looks, and the quiet tapping of knuckles against wood. Even children stopped speaking, not because they understood the danger, but because they imitated their elders, and because the shadows seemed to move more when someone spoke aloud. The village had become a wound that learned not to bleed, a place forgotten by time, and soon by itself. Only one house still whispered, Myi's house. Not loudly, never aloud, but within the walls something stirred,
Some said they saw the curtains move, even when the windows were nailed shut. Some said they heard tapping at night, rhythmic, slow, like fingers drumming a table from beneath the floor. And sometimes, when the wind was still, you could hear a voice, a small girl's voice, singing a lullaby no one had ever taught her. The words had no meaning, but they felt like a name that had been broken into pieces. Then came the forgetting. Not by accident, by choice. People began removing their names from memory. They destroyed family records, burned ancestral tablets, took knives to old wedding scrolls. Even the midwife buried her own birth certificate beneath the altar and wept. Because if you had no name, you couldn't be whispered. One man gouged his name off the family gate with a machete. Another tore down every calendar in his home, fearing even the names of months. They erased labels, carved out initials, dissolved ink in boiling pots. And still, people vanished. Sometimes slowly, forgetting pieces of themselves. Sometimes all at once, with nothing left but clothes on the floor and dust in their beds. One morning, the eldest woman in the village, who hadn't spoken in years, walked into the square and screamed, loud, once, just one word, a name, her own. Then she collapsed. By sunset, her house was gone. Not just empty, gone. Where it once stood was now a space no one could look at directly, like the land had been unstitched there, like reality had blinked. And so the village made a final vow. No more names, no more sounds, no more memory. They sealed their mouths with ash. They wore bands of thread over their lips. They tied bells to their ankles so that if someone ever did vanish, at least the bell might remember where they walked. They stopped writing, stopped drawing, stopped dreaming. Even their sleep became shallow for fear that a whisper might find its way in. And still, the girl remained. Up in the altar room, growing taller, even without food, even without breath. Me had become part of the silence too. She did not speak, did not move. She knelt for hours beside the altar, head bowed, her hands bleeding from where she tried to carve a name into her skin, then stopped halfway, because she no longer remembered whose name it was. Hers? Her daughter's? Or the name of whatever had taken her place? She only knew that each time she thought of the name, the red thread around her wrist grew tighter. The village dogs stopped barking. The birds flew wide circles around the rooftops. Even insects avoided the trees near the well, the one where the girl's name had once been whispered and carried away by the water. The frogs fell silent, the crickets stopped at dusk, and the sound of life vanished. At night, the villagers no longer lit lanterns, not because of darkness, but because reflections had become the only thing that still spoke. A bowl of water left untouched too long would ripple without cause. An empty teacup would tremble at sunrise. A spoon held just so would show a child's face even when there was no child, especially when there was no child. And in the dreams that survived, there was a single repeating moment. A girl standing at the edge of the forest, her hands behind her back, her head tilted sideways, and a whisper, not into the dreamer's ear, but into their memory, so that when they woke, They no longer knew where they were, or who, or why the silence felt like it had always been there. Eventually, the village became a place of gesture only. People moved like shadows of themselves. Homes were swept, food was grown, firewood was chopped, but all without sound, without thought, without identity, as if the land itself was trying to erase the idea that it had ever spoken. They no longer remembered the girl's name because no one dared, but she remembered, and in that remembering, she grew stronger, because nothing clings harder than a name unspoken, and nothing is more dangerous than a silence that listens back.
There was a time when reflections stayed where they belonged, inside still water, inside polished glass, inside the quiet curve of a rice bowl. They mirrored the world, obeyed light, followed the living. But not anymore. Now the reflections moved first. It began at dawn when the butcher's daughter fetched water from the well. She bent over the edge, bucket in hand, but paused. Something wasn't right. Her own reflection was already there, smiling, waiting, and blinking too slowly. Then, without warning, it tilted its head. She hadn't. She dropped the bucket and ran. But later that day, she was found sitting in the corner of her room, not blinking at all. Her pupils glassy, her lips pale. She didn't respond to touch or sound, only to water. Whenever a bowl or basin was placed nearby, her head would turn toward it, as if listening, as if waiting for her reflection to speak back. The villagers had grown used to whispers, but this was new. This was movement. Mimicry turned to disobedience. Mirrors once used for grooming now showed rooms with shadows that didn't belong. A face behind your shoulder, a child crouching beside your chair, a hand reaching up from the edge of the glass, slowly curling around nothing. And when you looked away, then back, the reflection had returned to normal. But deep down you knew it had noticed you, noticing you. One man, terrified, sealed every reflective surface in his home. Metal pots, water jugs, window panes, all wrapped in straw and linen. He never drank from anything smooth again, only cracked clay cups, chipped bowls, cloudy jars, until one night he forgot. He drank from a bamboo ladle and saw his own reflection smiling at him. He hadn't smiled in weeks. He dropped the ladle, fell to the ground, and whispered, "It's loose." When they found him, he was standing in the center of his home, eyes rolled back, repeating the same phrase, "The mirror walked before I did." Then he fell forward and did not cast a shadow. Stories multiplied. A farmer swore he saw a reflection of someone who hadn't lived in the village for decades, brushing her hair in his window. A child's water bowl overflowed without being touched, the ripples spelling letters that rearranged into a forgotten name. One girl covered her face with mud after she saw herself blink, after she had already turned away. Then came the shifting paths. At night, reflections stopped mimicking their owners and began walking on their own. Seen in windows, glass doors, puddles, even droplets on leaves. Shadow forms of villagers moving in places their real bodies were not. One boy was seen sitting at the river, even as his family confirmed he was asleep in bed. But when they woke him, he screamed in a voice not his own, "Don't pull me back, I'm not done watching." The elders tried once more to intervene, this time with a ritual far older than words. They gathered at the foot of the banyan tree, once a place of blessings, now twisted and hollowed. They burned salt. They spun thread backward. They lit oil lamps with no flame, only smoke. Then they held up a broken shard of glass and whispered, "Return, return, return." But the reflection didn't return. It stepped out. Just one leg, then a hand, then half a torso, shimmering, insubstantial, but undeniably real. A child-sized figure of shadow and glass, blinking with eyes that remembered too much. They shattered the shard. The figure dissolved into mist. But the next day, their own reflections were delayed, as if catching up. And then they stopped being seen at all. No reflections, no images, just blankness. People stood before water, before polished wood, and saw nothing. No face, no outline, no trace. As if the world no longer recognized them, as if the very light had abandoned them. And in that absence, they felt watched, because the reflections were still there. They had simply turned their backs. Only the girl in the altar room cast both a shadow and a reflection, always. Her body never moved, but her reflection did. Sometimes she blinked faster. Sometimes she tilted her head even when the body remained still. Sometimes she smiled. And once, only once, she reached out of the mirror with both hands and wrote something in steam. A single sentence. "I am the one remembering you." Me no longer entered the room. She left offerings at the door, bowls of salted rice, thread, burnt ash, and water already stirred. But even from downstairs, she could see the glint of movement in the mirror near the altar. And sometimes, when she dared glance up the stairwell, she would see her own reflection at the top, even when she knew she hadn't moved. The villagers began destroying everything that held a shine. Homes were stripped of glass, metal, water jars. Lanterns were dulled with soot. Rainwater was covered with cloth. Still the reflections found new ways. In ink, in sweat, in the glaze of a cooking pot, even in eyes. One old man looked into his grandson's pupils and saw his own face, smiling cruelly. He blindfolded himself that night. The next morning, he was gone. His blindfold was found hanging from a tree. His reflection still seen pacing the rice fields in every puddle. People stopped looking at anything. They kept their eyes down, their water cloudy, their skin smudged, because to see was to be seen, and to be seen was to be chosen. Then came the day the girl's reflection walked into the square. Not her body, just her image, reflected across the surface of the well, onto the stone paths, into the shadows under doorways. She didn't speak, she only stared. And every villager present that day forgot the shape of their own faces. They touched their cheeks like strangers, looked at their hands as if borrowed. Mouths moved, but no sound came.
And when they looked into water again, they didn't see themselves. They saw her. Always her. They say she no longer waits in mirrors. She uses them, not to reflect, but to enter. A door cracked, a ripple opened, a name remembered, and when she walks through, something else takes your place. So now the villagers live without mirrors, without water left still, without even shadows, where possible. They keep their homes smoky, their eyes lowered, their surfaces scratched. Because if you ever see her reflection again, it means she has already passed by, and you were too late to look away.
The house was burning, and the girl didn't blink. It began like all endings do, quietly. A lantern knocked over, a mat left too close to the flame, or perhaps something older finally igniting. No one knew how the fire started, only that it did, only that it spread without smoke, without warning, and without heat, as if the flames were hungry for something colder than flesh. They say Meh stood at the threshold, barefoot, her face illuminated by orange light as the wood cracked and curled behind her. She didn't scream, she didn't run. She simply watched, like someone seeing a funeral she had long prepared for, or witnessing the final breath of a ghost who never died. The neighbors tried to help. Buckets of sand, wet cloths, prayers between trembling lips, but the fire would not touch the walls. It only burned inside, consuming air, memory, and sound. One man swore he heard voices, hundreds, weeping and laughing inside the flame. Another saw figures dancing behind the smoke, children with no eyes, mothers with open mouths, shadows bound in red thread. And at the center of it all, behind the altar door, she sat, untouched, still, watching the world she'd been sealed into begin to burn. M's husband had returned days before, not the same man, older, quieter. He had heard rumors from soldiers stationed in the hills of a village swallowed by silence, of mirrors that killed, of a child who never grew older, yet never stayed the same. He didn't believe it until he saw his daughter in the window, smiling, even though she had never breathed in his arms. He had come to destroy the altar room, to end what should have never begun. He brought oil, rope, a match. But the moment he stepped inside, the door closed behind him, on its own. No one could open it. From outside, the villagers watched shadows writhe behind the window. His voice was never heard, but they say his reflection ran past the glass before his body did. And in the final moment, just before flame consumed the stairs, he whispered one word, "I remember." Then silence. Meh did not run. She walked upstairs, alone. Each step groaned like a warning. Each breath came slower. She opened the altar door with both hands, even as heat licked her skin. Inside, the girl sat as always, eyes open, mouth parted, the red thread hanging from her wrist like a leash no longer tied to anyone. Meh knelt, not in surrender, but in something stranger, acceptance. She looked at her daughter, the vessel, the echo, the mistake made from love, And for the first time in months, maybe years, she spoke. A single word. The name. The true name. The one she had whispered during the ritual. And the girl blinked. Twice. Then leaned forward and whispered something back. Not in words, not in language, but in memory. A flood of every face that had been erased, every name, every voice, every thread cut from the village. They poured into Meh's ears like wind through broken jars. She shook, she screamed, her skin cracked, and her mouth began to bleed, not from injury, but from remembrance. Then the bleeding stopped, because her lips were no longer there. Thread had returned, not just across her mouth, but around her jaw, her throat, her chest, a web of silence sewn by something invisible, pulling her closed. Her body slumped forward, her eyes glassed over, but she was still breathing, and she was still smiling. Downstairs, the fire burned brighter, but the walls remained intact. Only the language of the house was destroyed, the letters carved into old beams, the prayer scrolls on the altar, the chants etched into ceramics, all of it blackened, crumbling. Only ash remained. And in the middle of it all, in a patch of untouched floor, the bowl, uncracked, full of clear water. Inside it, a name swirled, never written, never settled, just a suggestion, just a trap. By morning, the fire had died, but the house had changed. Not ruined, just emptier, as if the space between each wooden beam had stretched wider, as if time had been bled from the walls, as if meaning itself had been rinsed from the floorboards. The villagers stood outside and watched as Meh walked out, alone. Her hair white, her mouth sewn shut, her eyes glassy, and yet she was humming. Not a tune, not music, but syllables, sounds that felt familiar, even though no one could name them. They seeped into your skin, made your knees weak, brought tears for reasons you couldn't explain. And as she passed, the villagers bowed their heads, not in respect, not in grief, but because they felt something moving behind their eyes, and they were afraid to look in a mirror afterward. Meh never spoke again, but her silence carried power. She would sit beside the bowl every morning and dip her fingers in, let the water move, let the name drift. And when she looked into the reflection, she nodded, as if agreeing with something, as if confirming what had already been decided. The villagers no longer asked questions. They did not touch the house. They did not speak Meh's name, if they remembered it at all. She became a figure of ritual, a shadow of love, a living reminder of what happens when sorrow outruns tradition. Some say the girl still sits inside. Others say she walks now, in silence, barefoot, her eyes reflecting things that haven't happened yet. But all agree on one thing. The mother gave her a name, and in return, she was given something far more permanent, a voice that never dies.
They didn't die. They simply vanished. Not all at once, piece by piece. It began with small forgettings. A woman misplaced her shoes, then her shadow. A child forgot how to draw circles,
then forgot what her mother looked like. An elder stared into his bowl of rice and could not remember whether he had ever tasted food before. Their bodies remained, but their being, the quiet thread of memory that held them together, began to unravel, softly, silently, without struggle. No one spoke of it, because speaking required names, and names required recognition. But in the village, faces blurred, voices dulled. People passed each other and felt a chill, as if someone familiar had walked by, yet couldn't be remembered. One day you had neighbors, the next you had strangers with empty eyes, and then you had nothing. They stopped keeping records. What was the point? Books rotted in their hands, paper peeled into flakes, ink ran like tears. Even carvings faded from wood, names once etched into door frames, now smooth and pale, as if time had licked them away. The well no longer reflected faces, only shapes, flickering, glitching, moving before the real person did, sometimes not moving at all, sometimes turning and looking up, even when no one stood nearby. And when they did, the water was still, empty, waiting. One by one, villagers began to forget themselves, not their memories, not their homes, but their core, the invisible thread that says, "I am me." A farmer once walked into the rice field and stared at his hands for hours. When asked what he was doing, he said, "These aren't mine. I don't remember who they belong to." The next morning, his hands were gone. Clean stumps. No blood. Just skin. As if the memory of being whole had vanished and the body obeyed. Children faded fastest. They hadn't lived long enough to anchor deeply. One day a group of them were playing near the banyan tree, laughing without sound. The next, the grass was flattened in small circles, but the children were nowhere to be found. No footprints, no toys, only a faint, cold wind that whispered syllables too soft to catch. And a thread, red, tied to the tree, tied to nothing. Some villagers tried to fight it. They carved their names into stone, tattooed them onto skin, repeated them like mantras. I am Tao, I am Tao, I am Tao. Until one day, her reflection mouthed the same name before she did. And the moment it did, she blinked out. No scream, no collapse, just an outline of dust where she had stood, and a name carved into the wall, slowly cracking, as if being peeled from reality. The house of the potter collapsed on itself overnight, not from storm, not from age, but from absence. The air inside it felt hollow, even to those standing outside, as if no one had ever lived there. And maybe no one had, not anymore. Even the animals felt it. Dogs refused to enter homes they'd known for years. Cats stared into corners, ears twitching, backs arched, at something that no longer cast a shadow. The rooster crowed at midnight, then stopped, forever. And the oxen, once strong and stubborn, began refusing to move their carts, as if afraid to carry names that no longer had owners. Me watched from her doorstep. Every morning she dipped her hand into the bowl beside the altar, swirled it once, looked down, and nodded. Sometimes, after doing so, a name would vanish from someone's memory. Sometimes, a body would vanish from a home. Sometimes, Even the house would fade slightly, as if its outline was being erased by a gentle brush. She wasn't cursing them, she was remembering them, and that was far more dangerous. Because in this village, memory was no longer a blessing, it was a summons. To remember someone was to call them back. To bring their name into thought was to hand it over, and to speak it aloud was to offer it as a thread she could pull, backward, until nothing remained. Eventually, the villagers developed a ritual. Each night, before sleep, they would hold a bowl of ash and whisper into it all the names they still remembered, then burn it, so the names could be gone by morning, so they wouldn't tempt the girl, so they wouldn't feed the mirror. One day, an entire family disappeared, all 7, not over days, but overnight. The home stood still, candles still lit, food still warm, but every chair empty. Their shadows remained, faint outlines burned into the floor like memories that had tried too hard to hold on. One bowl remained in the center of the home, filled with water, still, clear, and in it, 8 faces, not 7, 8. One face too many. That was when the elders understood. She wasn't just remembering names, she was collecting them, holding them in water, in glass, in breath, tied not to faces, but to meaning. And once the meaning faded, so did the person. Now the villagers no longer tried to hold on. They let go of names, of memory, of even mourning. They spoke to no one, held no funerals, marked no losses, because to grieve was to remember, and to remember was to risk being next. Me still sat in silence, still dipped her hand into the bowl, still looked at the altar, but her face was different now, empty, peaceful, like someone who had released all burden, because the last thread that had held her was gone. Her name, once a soft cry of longing, no longer echoed in her mind. She had given it to the girl, and in doing so, she had become invisible. They call them the vanishing ones now. Not dead, not ghosts, just forgotten. Drifting between syllables that were never said, living only in mirrors that no longer reflect. Their footsteps echo without bodies, their laughter rises from empty chairs, and sometimes, late at night, you feel a hand on your shoulder. Not cold, not cruel, just curious, as if asking, "Do you remember me?"
The census official came on a Tuesday. He wore a white shirt stained with rain, a clipboard tucked beneath his arm, and a bag full of forms no one would ever fill. He wasn't from the village. He didn't know the silence, didn't see the missing names on the road signs, didn't notice the abandoned shrines along the path. He thought the village was just forgotten by infrastructure, not forgotten by memory itself. He arrived around noon, under overcast skies and damp trees. He expected greetings, conversations, maybe even suspicion. But no one spoke, not even to say hello. They stared, some from doorways, some from behind veils of smoke or cracked shutters. Their eyes were hollow, not unfriendly, just drifting, as if they hadn't heard a stranger's voice in years. Or maybe they no longer understood what stranger meant. He knocked on 5 doors. Only one opened. An old man with clouded eyes and thread
bound across his mouth. The official smiled, introduced himself, held up his clipboard and said, "I'm just here for a count, a head count. Names, ages, family units, simple stuff." The man looked at him, then turned and walked back inside. Didn't close the door, didn't invite him in, just vanished into the shadows. The official made notes anyway, wrote down one elder male, approximate 70s, guessed at the spelling, moved on. He didn't know that by writing down even that much, he had already been seen, not by the man, but by the reflection watching from a bowl in the corner of the room. The water rippled once, then stilled, then began to glow. He kept going, house by house, empty chairs, empty beds, bowls of ash on the floor. He thought they were poor. He thought they were mourning something. He wasn't wrong. He just didn't understand what they were mourning. At the center of the village, he found the old hall. No name on the arch, no sign, just silence. He stepped inside. Dust clung to the air like breath held too long. He opened his notebook, called out softly, "Is anyone here?" The wind answered. So did something else. From the far end of the room, behind the altar where old village names had once been etched into wood, he saw a girl sitting, still, watching. Her face pale, her eyes black, her mouth moving, not aloud, just forming shapes, like a name being whispered too softly to hear. He blinked. She was gone. But the feeling remained, like his blood had turned slightly colder, like his name had just been written down somewhere else. He left quickly, but not before peeking into a cracked mirror on the wall, just for a second, long enough to see himself and something behind him. Not a person, not a shadow, just a smile that wasn't his. That night, he stayed in the village's only guest hut, lit a lantern, checked his notes, realized he couldn't remember a single name he had written down, only marks, lines, dashes where names should have been. He looked at his own name tag, the one clipped to his shirt, and for a moment the letters shimmered, faded, blurred, then returned, but not quite the same. He took it off and threw it in his bag. He didn't sleep, not really. In the early morning, he walked back toward the house with the altar. He didn't know why, just that something inside him whispered, "Finish what you started." He opened the door. No one stopped him, not even her. She was waiting, sitting in the same place, eyes fixed, hands folded, a bowl of clear water at her feet, and in the reflection, not hers, his, but different, older, tired, and smiling like someone who had given up everything and finally found peace. He stepped forward. She raised her hand, not threatening, just beckoning. A single gesture. Come closer. He did, because by then he could no longer remember what he had come here for. He couldn't recall the name of his department, or why his clipboard felt heavier than it should. He couldn't even remember his own last name. It itched at the edge of his thoughts, just beyond reach. Something with a V or an H? Gone. He knelt before her and whispered, "Do you know me?" She nodded, just once, then dipped her finger into the bowl. The water swirled, Not fast, just enough to pull something down into it, something he hadn't meant to give. He stood and left, didn't look back, didn't say goodbye. By the time he reached the edge of the village, he had forgotten the path he came in on. The clipboard was gone, his bag lighter. Even his shoes seemed unfamiliar, like they belonged to someone else. When he arrived at the nearest district office, he didn't report anything. He handed in a blank form. When asked his name, he smiled, paused, and said, "I think I've already been counted," and walked out. They never heard from him again, but in his notebook, found weeks later in a bus terminal restroom, was a single phrase written over and over. What remains without a name becomes something entirely else. Now, when the census sends new officials, they skip that village. Too remote, they say. No activity, no record, no map. The name of the village itself has been scratched out on old lists, unreadable, faded, somehow missing. But the villagers are still there, living, moving, breathing. They just no longer need names, because names invite memory, and memory invites her. And once she remembers you, you don't belong to yourself anymore.
There was only one elder left who remembered the old rites. Not the soft blessings of incense and prayer, but the dark ones. The kind carved in blood and ash, whispered backward into silence, sealed in bone and fire. His name was long gone. Even he couldn't recall it. But he knew what he was, what he had always been trained to become. The final tether, the one who unknots what should never have been bound. He hadn't spoken in years, not because he couldn't, but because the words in his throat no longer belonged to him. They were borrowed, rented from an era when names still held shape. And now, only one word remained in his chest: undo. He had watched the girl grow without growing, watched the village forget itself, watched the fire take the father, the thread take the mother, and the mirror take the rest. He didn't grieve. Grief was for those who had something left to lose. Instead, he waited until the bowl began to overflow. One morning, the water wouldn't stop spilling. From the altar room, it leaked down the stairs like a slow, steady weeping, soaking into the wood, pooling on the floor, seeping into cracks like it was searching for roots. He followed it, step by step, barefoot, carrying something wrapped in yellowed cloth and tied with 3 strands of red thread. When he reached the top, the girl looked at him, not surprised, not afraid, just expectant, as if she'd been waiting. He sat cross-legged before her, placed the object on the floor between them, unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a jar, no lid, no decorations, just smooth, ancient stone carved from the earth beneath the old mountain temples. Inside the jar, bone fragments, not human, not entirely, something older, something sacred, bone that had been used in the last known ritual of reversal, the rite that unbinds a soul from a name, but only once, and only if the soul agrees. The girl tilted her head. She didn't speak, didn't move, but the reflections behind her began to ripple, as if listening, as if leaning closer. The elder placed a single hair from his own head into the jar, then one drop of blood from his tongue. Then, without looking away, he whispered the unword,
a syllable not meant for ears, a sound that existed only in memory, passed down through breath and bone. The girl blinked once. Then her eyes turned black, not dark, empty, as if the stars had gone out inside her, and the room grew cold. The reflections disappeared, every one. Mirrors went blank, water turned flat, even eyes stopped glinting. The world became matte, colorless, silent, because she had withdrawn, not left, just pulled her presence back like a tide preparing for a wave. The elder dropped the final piece into the bone jar, a sliver of her original wrapping cloth, from the night she was born dead, the black silk that had once held her tiny body before it held something else. He sealed the jar with red thread and ash, then closed his eyes and waited. Nothing happened for a moment. Then the jar began to hum, low, vibrating the floorboards, the walls, even the bones in his chest. The hum became a wail, not from outside, but from inside the memory of the room. Old voices, lost names, cries of those who had been taken, begging not for release, but for recognition, to be remembered once before vanishing forever. The girl wept for the first time, but her tears weren't wet. They were threads, thin strands of red sliding down her cheeks, stitching her to the floor, to the walls, to the jar. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out, only names, thousands, spoken without breath, swirling through the air like ash in reverse. The jar cracked, once, twice, then shattered, not loudly, but like a whisper torn in half. The room trembled, and all at once the threads snapped. Her body slumped, not lifeless, not human, just empty, as if the soul inside had been pulled back into the jar with the fragments of all she had taken. The reflections returned, but they were slow, soft, like animals emerging from deep water. And when the elder looked into the bowl, he saw only himself, no one else, no whisper, no echo, just a man with no name, and finally, peace. He took what was left of the jar, carried it into the forest, to the place where the soil was black and warm, where birds flew nowhere, and even trees bent away. He buried it deep, no markers, no stones, just silence. He bowed 3 times, then never returned. In the days that followed, something strange happened. People began remembering. Not everything, not everyone, but small things. A face, a laugh, the color of a roof, the smell of a scarf, even the shape of their own names, fuzzy, broken, but there. And with memory came weight. The village, once hollow, began to breathe again. Not fully, not safely, but enough to begin again. As for the girl, her body was gone, the altar room empty, the bowl dry. Only the thread remained, coiled in a corner, still red, still waiting, because some names are never truly erased, only unspoken, and if ever spoken again, the bone jar will crack once more, and memory will come for what it's bowed.
The village is quiet now, not in fear, not in mourning, but in peace. The kind of silence that arrives only after the storm, when the last echo has faded and the world dares to listen again. Time has passed,
enough for trees to split rooftops, enough for vines to climb the empty schoolhouse walls, enough for the wind to forget the path it once took to carry whispers through the rice fields. The land breathes slower now, as if the curse has finally gone to sleep. But traces remain. You can feel it in the soil, warm and restless. You can feel it in the water, still too still. And if you walk into the heart of the village at dusk, you'll notice something missing. Not a sound, not a shadow, but a name. There are no markers here. No road signs, no village gate, no carved stones, no map pin. It is a place without title, a settlement without introduction, a home without history. Because names, in the end, were what called the darkness, and in silence, they found their freedom. But the story doesn't end there, because one day, long after the threads had rotted and the last bowl had cracked, a family arrived. Not villagers, not descendants, just travelers, wanderers, looking for land to settle. They had never heard the stories, the whispers, the girl, the vanishing. All they saw were open fields, broken homes, and the quiet kind of emptiness that begged to be filled. They repaired a house, cleared the wells, breathed life into soil that hadn't been touched in years. They sang, they laughed, they named things again. Each other, their animals, their child. And the child, like children do, wandered. She found the old altar one morning, just a pile of stone and dust, nothing threatening, only a bowl half buried in the ground, holding water from last night's rain. She peered inside and saw herself, then another face. Then the water stilled. She ran back home breathless, tugged at her father's shirt, and asked, "What was this place called?" He paused, touched her hair, looked out across the golden fields, and said, "I don't know." She smiled, then whispered something to the wind, a name of her own choosing, something soft, something new. The wind didn't answer, but in the distance, somewhere between memory and forgetting, a small voice stirred, not angry, not vengeful, just awake. Because names have weight, and names leave marks, even when erased, even when buried, even when whispered only once. So now the villagers are long gone, but the story remains, carried in reflections, hidden in puddles after rain, etched into the backs of broken mirrors. The girl is gone, yes, but the silence she left behind still listens, still waits. And one day, if you ever walk through that nameless village, if you ever look into a bowl too long, if you ever hear your name spoken when no one is there, don't answer, don't turn, don't speak, just walk away. Because in some corners of the world, names still echo, and some names remember you back.